We've been talking about cellular respiration. Earlier in the year, we talked about things like active transport and how the cell has to use ATP to bring things into the cell if they're large or if we want to pump them. We can also talk about things like muscle contractions. If you want to contract a muscle, you have to use energy to do that. So we know that ATP is the form of energy that cells use, and we know that cells get ATP by breaking down carbohydrates, taking the energy in our food and putting it into the energy of ATP. We even looked at the molecule of ATP and saw what ATP looks like when it has a lot of energy. So we know that this molecule ATP is very important for cells. And we know that we get that ATP by breaking down carbs like glucose. But now the question is, where does that glucose come from? Think for a second about sugars and carbs. And where would you get sugars and carbs? A lot of people, when they think of glucose or sugar, think of candy. Well, sugar comes from sugar cane. Can you think of something that is living that you might eat that gives you sugar, that tastes sweet? Maybe something like an apple or an orange. So what we actually want to focus on is, where do carbs come from? Carbs are going to come from plants. And so what we're going to see is that plants are what are doing all of this work. So let's back up for a second and talk just about energy. Energy comes in many forms. You have radiant energy, which comes from the sun, chemical energy, which is stored in the bonds of molecules like glucose and ATP. So it is important for us to know that there are lots of different types of energy. There's also kinetic energy, like temperature, potential energy, like a spring that's wound really tight, and gravitational energy. All of those are types of energy. You'll notice that you wrote about radiant and chemical energy, and these are the types of energy that we focus on in biology class. The others you would focus on in physics class or chemistry class. So we look at autotrophs, and these are organisms. These are living things. Autotrophs, auto actually means self, and troph means feeding. Autotrophs are organisms that can build their own food, not animals. Even though you can make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you don't actually build that. Autotrophs, like plants and plant-like organisms, autotrophs use photosynthesis to transform light energy into chemical energy. This means that a plant can take energy from the sun and build a chemical out of it. Animals can't do that, only plants. And the chemical that they build is actually glucose. So let's look a little closer at what plants actually do. Plants have a pigment to absorb light called chlorophyll. Now, animals have pigments. Your skin color, hair color, eye color, those are pigments. Your pigment reflects and absorbs light. Plants have a pigment called chlorophyll that can absorb almost all types of light except for green light, which is reflected. If something is reflected, that means that it's not used. So we want to make a note there where it says except green light, which is reflected. We want to make a note that says plants can't use green light. So if I were to give a plant only green light, that plant wouldn't be very successful. Plants use that light energy to build carbohydrates like glucose. So this is the equation for photosynthesis. And I like the word photosynthesis because synthesis means to make, and photo actually means light. A photograph is taken using light. Photosynthesis is when we make something using light, and what we're making is glucose. So I'd like for you now to actually add in the chemical formulas, because you should know these chemical formulas from when we learned respiration. The chemical formula for carbon dioxide is CO2. The chemical formula for water is H2O. For light energy, we just have light. But sugar's the hard one to remember, but it comes in sixes. C6H12O6. That's our chemical formula for glucose or sugar. And oxygen is O2. So we're starting to get introduced to how does photosynthesis work. Remember, the whole point of photosynthesis is to make sugar or glucose. And that is stored energy. That's how the plant makes its own food. Sadly, the plant will actually have to break down that food when it needs ATP. But the main goal of photosynthesis is to make carbs. Oxygen is actually released as a waste. So plants and plant-like things like algae actually release oxygen as a waste. Let's talk about the where. Photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast. We've seen the chloroplast before. The chloroplast has stacks of membranes, and these stacks of membranes help absorb light. One thing that we want to notice about the chloroplast is you can see in this picture that light is coming through. And you can also see that some light is reflected or released. We do want to make a note that the chloroplast reflect, or not use. If it's reflected, it's not being used. Green light. Now, besides light coming into the chloroplast, there's also two other things that would be coming into the chloroplast. These are your reactants, the things the chloroplast needs to build sugars. Two things would be made. One is going to be used, and one is going to be released as waste. So you should be able to tell me what's coming in to be used. What are the reactants? We already see light coming in. There's two other things that have to come in. And then there's two things that are made. One of them is a waste product. But so we do need to be able to recognize the chloroplast with these stacks of membranes and know that the point of the chloroplast is to absorb that light. Factors that can affect the rate of photosynthesis. We have to have our reactants. We have to have carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. And you'll want to put a little star by carbon dioxide because it's one of the most important things. If the plant doesn't have carbon dioxide, it cannot build the sugar. Also, temperature can affect the rate or speed of photosynthesis because too high of a temperature can actually denature the enzymes. So as we finish up, we want to see how photosynthesis and respiration are similar. Now pause for a second because you do need to have this equation memorized. So please make sure that you memorize your photosynthesis equation and work to practice some of this new vocabulary. Okay, so we're on our last slide. Oops. Here we go. About how photosynthesis and respiration both transfer energy. So what's important to know is that they both are transferring some type of energy. Photosynthesis transfers sunlight to chemical energy in glucose. And respiration transfers the chemical energy in glucose to the chemical energy in ATP. So we have have a picture here that shows sunlight coming into the chloroplast and sugar being made. So we want to make a small note that sugar is storing energy. But remember, this type of energy that the mitochondria makes, ATP, is smaller energy. Oops. Smaller energy. So remember that both glucose and ATP are chemical energy sources. Chemical energy in glucose, in the bonds of glucose, and chemical energy in ATP, in the bonds of ATP. But ATP is smaller and easier for the cells to use. So the first relationship we see is that both photosynthesis and respiration transfer energy. Energy from the sun into glucose, and then energy in the glucose into ATP. Now keep in mind, all living things perform respiration. All living things. Now only plants and plant-like perform photosynthesis. So a human, a whale, a cat can't do photosynthesis. But every living thing will do respiration. The plant actually has to build sugar, and then if it wants ATP, the plant actually has to break down the sugar to get ATP. The second thing that we see is that both photosynthesis and respiration cycle matter. Now let's talk for a second about what matter means. The next sentence tells us that the reactants of one are almost the products of the other. So what does that mean? Well, matter are things like, so let's circle matter. Matter are things like glucose, C6H12O6. That's matter. Oxygen is matter. Carbon dioxide is matter. H2O is matter. All of these molecules are matter, or parts of our universe. And so photosynthesis and respiration both cycle. Notice the difference here between the word cycle and the word transfer. Cycle means that it's a constant cycle going around. Notice how the energy is coming in and going out. But things like CO2 get cycled. Respiration makes CO2 and H2O. Photosynthesis uses CO2 and H2O. Photosynthesis makes sugars and oxygen. Respiration uses sugars and oxygen. So the equations are almost opposites of each other. Not exactly, because respiration doesn't make sunlight. We make ATP, a different source of energy. So at this point, you do need to be able to memorize your photosynthesis information, but also be able to compare photosynthesis and respiration.